Today on iGen Designs, we're going to be creating an awesome set of cutting boards using some walnut and maple. I'll be making some very specific cuts to create this pattern in the main set of boards. I will then glue those together and run them through my crosscut sled to create these strips. Once I have those strips, I can then turn them on their edge and alternate every board to create this diamond pattern. The end product is a really attractive looking end-grain cutting board that's great for gifts and great for use around the kitchen. So if you want to see how I did it, stick around and I'll show you how. I've done a number of cutting boards on this channel, but today I wanted to push the limits of what was possible and something that I had never seen before. So I started out with a sketch to create what does that cross-section of wood need to look like to create that pattern. Once I had that sketch, I went and grabbed some walnut and some maple that I had in my garage, and I got to work. For this project, I started off by running every board through the thickness planer until every board in my collection was the same height. For this particular design, whenever you've got two diagonal pieces of wood that form a square shape, you really can't thickness plane it once that shape is formed. Otherwise, you'll mess up the pattern. So really important to get that right. Once I ran everything through the thickness planer and I had my maple, I had my walnut, I decided to turn my attention to some thinner strips of maple. I got some 1/4-inch strips that I ran through the table saw. Then I just put them through the planer to make sure that they were all the same thickness and had a nice finish on them. I found that this can simplify things when it comes to glue up. I decided to begin the cutting with the most complicated cuts of the project, which was the 45-degree ripped edges on the maple and the walnut wood. This allowed me to safely plan these long, more complicated cuts while I still had the most material in each board remaining. I decided to make one long 45-degree ripped edge cut and then flip the board over, bring in the fence to finish off that long triangular cut. Once I had all the pieces cut, I then did a dry fit on the workbench just to make sure that I could replicate the pattern that I had designed in my workbook earlier. So far, things are looking pretty good. I made some minor adjustments, but the diamond pattern in the middle is really what we're going for. You have to think a little bit differently when you look at the board as it is now, thinking that you're going to turn everything on the face grain to make the pattern later. There's a number of ways you could choose to glue up these boards together. I decided to glue up the diagonal pieces first before incorporating that as a part of the larger glue up. Because you're applying pressure along two diagonal pieces, if you apply too much clamping force, they just want to slip past each other. So I found a creative way to use some compression clamps along each of the diagonals to make sure that they couldn't slip past each other, and then apply vertical clamping force from the parallel clamps that I have to make sure that there is good contact throughout the entire diagonal. It's important that you get that right, otherwise you could end up with gaps in the seam along that diagonal face. Once each of the diagonal pieces had a chance to be glued and dried, the rest of the glue up is just like any other glue up that I've done for my other cutting boards. The one extra attention to detail that I would offer as a suggestion is to make sure that the diagonal pieces that you put in the gluing position here are in the right orientation. You could very easily get these backwards, and then rather than creating a diamond pattern, you could be creating something a little bit different. So make sure you got the orientation right, and this glue up should be just like any other cutting board glue up I've done in the past. Another thing I've learned is that you don't have to apply a lot of pressure during a glue up clamp like this. You just have to apply enough pressure to get an even bead of glue coming through the seam, but you don't want to over clamp it because you can actually cause some other problems like bowing, twisting, and misalignment. I'm going to slow this video down here so that anybody that's wanting to create this particular cutting board can see the pattern that I made using the boards. Hopefully that'll help answer any questions about the alignment of the various boards to create that pattern. After the boards had been in the clamps for about 2 hours, I decided to remove the clamps, take the board out, and let the glue finish curing overnight. I needed the clamps for another project that I was working on, but the glue wasn't quite set up enough to run it through the planer, so I decided to give it a night, but use my clamps for something else. Now, I didn't mention this earlier, but I intentionally kept the width of these boards to be less than 13 inches so that I could run it through my thickness planer to make sure that all the boards were the same height and all the glue could get knocked off pretty easily. If you had a drum sander, that would do the job just fine. Those are often wider than planers. Or if you just had a radial over a sander, you could use that as well. It just takes a little bit more time. I personally have found that the planer just makes this step a lot quicker, so I like to limit the width of my boards so that I could go through this step pretty quickly. Before cutting any strips, I decided to put a nice 90-degree edge on the boards that we just got through gluing and planing. I use my crosscut sled to do this because I know that it's calibrated exactly to 90 degrees. If you're interested to see how I built this crosscut sled, I'll leave a link to the video in the description below. I've actually gotten to the point where I trust my crosscut sled more than my miter saw, so I use this thing all the time. Now it's time to use a little math to figure out how wide each of the strips need to be. You can make the strips really thick and not have the cutting board be very wide, but in my particular case, I'm looking to make 2 cutting boards out of this. So I take the total length, which is 22 inches, and divide it by 16, which is the number of strips that I need, which works out to be about 1 3/8. And if you back out the 1/8 of an inch that you need for the kerf, which is how wide the blade is whenever you actually make a cut, each of the strips is going to be about 1 1/4 inches. So I set my stop block to 1 1/4 inches, and I began ripping strips one at a time. You can see here that this process goes really quickly if you've got a crosscut sled that's calibrated and you've got a working stop block that can be set to a particular distance. This thing goes really quick. I then take the 16 strips that we just cut, line them up, and then I alternate every other strip to face the other way. This is going to create the diamond pattern, and you can start to see how the final product is going to look once everything is finished. The final glue up is really straightforward. We're just using some more Titebond 3 and gluing the strips up in the orientation that we just had. You'll see me using tape anytime I use my clamps in a glue up because unfortunately I've had to learn the hard way that if you don't do that, you get some glue residue left behind, which makes the clamps a lot harder to use. So I'm taking better care of my clamps now by protecting them with tape, but if anyone out there has a trick on how to get rid of glue that's already on some parallel clamps, do me a favor and leave it in the comments section below, because I've got some red parallel clamps that I would love to clean up, but I just don't have a really good solution yet, so that would be really helpful for me. As with any end grain cutting board, there's a lot of sanding to do to get it in a showable condition. I've got an outline of the different sanding grits that I work through in the bottom right hand corner, but generally I try to work my way up all the way through to about 180 grit, and then I'll do something called water popping, which serves 2 purposes. The first is it raises the grain of the wood so that you can come back and sand down the fibers later, which will give it a smooth feel once you get the board wet for the first time. But this can also highlight areas of glue that you've missed, so whenever you do your final sanding, you can go back and catch them. After the water pop, I finish the sanding process with 220 grit, which is generally the finest grit that I'll go to with a cutting board. Next, it's back to the crosscut sled to put a nice clean edge on the long edge of the cutting board. I was grateful that this just barely fit within the footprint of my crosscut sled. I then flip the board over and do the same thing to the other side. With the final cuts on the board made, I head over to my router table to put a finishing edge on my cutting boards. In this particular case, I'm using a very subtle chamfer on all four edges of the cutting board. But there is a lot of creative freedom here, so if you wanted a round over edge or if you wanted to do something completely different, there's a lot of creativity that you could apply here. But I'm personally going with the chamfered edge because I think it's a really nice, clean, elegant look. The last step that I take is to use a sanding block with 220 grit sandpaper to make sure that there's no saw marks remaining on the long edges of the board, and also just to do a once-over on each of the chamfered edges. If you leave them unsanded from the router, it can be a little bit rough to the touch once you get it wet, so I just spend a little bit of time here to make a quality end product. The last step before applying the finish is just to attach the cutting board feet to the bottom. You don't have to use feet. I've just found that it makes the usage of the board a little bit more versatile and stable when making heavier cuts. But I do like to pre-drill the holes before screwing in the feet just to ensure you don't get any splitting in the wood. And now my favorite part is applying the mineral oil to the board. This is when you get to see the natural beauty of the wood really come to life as the mineral oil seeps into the grain and really just makes that color pop. But beyond just making the board look better, it's got some really nice practical advantages too. First of all, it's food safe, so anything you cut on a board finished with mineral oil will be completely fine to digest. But it saturates into the grain of the wood, which makes it oil wet, and it repels any moisture that would want to seep into the board or any juices from meats and other things that you might cut on the board from getting into it. The reason why mineral oil is chosen over other alternatives is because it won't go rancid. So there's some other food safe oils out there that are not ideal for cutting boards, but mineral oil is kind of the sweet spot of a bunch of different things that make it a great cutting board finish. Another great alternative is a combination of mineral oil and beeswax, which can really help give a lasting condition to the board. Both of those products are food safe and can help protect the wood and make your board last a long time. The cutting board has a really distinctive, unique pattern to it, which sets it apart from anything that you can buy at the store. The maple and the walnut colors really complement one another, and the pattern that we've created through the middle of the cutting board is just so unique and special. But beyond just looking good, end-grain cutting boards are super functional. Because the grain fibers are standing straight up, they're the most resilient to knife marks of all the cutting board types. This makes it a great choice for a cutting board that's going to be used on a daily basis. But even beyond the functionality, the fact that you've got two cutting boards that came from the same project makes this a really special gift if someone had a birthday, a Mother's Day gift, a housewarming present. It's something that is clearly a part of the same set, and that in itself brings a lot of functionality. You've got a smaller cutting board for things like vegetables and fruits, and you've got a larger cutting board if you had steaks that you wanted to cut up, chicken, maybe a brisket, something that you may not want to lug out every single day, but whenever you do need the bigger cutting board, you've got it. So definitely some appeal from a gift perspective. I want to thank you for watching this video. If you want to support me and my channel, please give me a like and subscribe to see more content like this, and I'll see you on the next one.